Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, this one just showed up on my recommended videos among the channels that I subscribe to, which is from Simple History, and it's called The Rotten Royals of Old England. So this is kind of right in my wheelhouse. I'm guessing it's going to have to do with British medieval history, at least somewhat. So that's something I feel like I know a little bit about. I haven't seen the video. I think it just came out yesterday or maybe the day before. So I'm excited to dive into this one. A bunch of announcements were made last night on the channel in the stream. If you want to check out the live stream from last night, it was all in the first 10 minutes or so. I mentioned the announcements about giveaways, about some changes on Patreon, as well as some additional perks, and of course our upcoming trip to Vicksburg. With all of that in mind, let's dive into this video.
The Rotten Royals of Old England. The British monarchs of the modern era are cultured, educated, and well-mannered. They exude sophistication, class, and elegance, acting as a moral figurehead to their subjects. However, the English kings and queens of the medieval and early modern period were a far cry from their more refined and polished descendants of today.
And you know, a big part of that is the times in which they live, right? I mean, if you compare now to then, I mean, we are a more refined society, you would think. I mean, not always, but most of the time. The very nature of kingship in the Middle Ages and in medieval times meant that you had to be ruthless and that you had to kill a lot of people. I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying that was the nature of the times.
The English monarchs of the past were disgusting, crude, and brash. Many of their habits, customs, and actions are considered impolite, rude, or gross by today's standards, and they often overindulged in their respective vices. William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror, England's first Norman king, was a short-tempered and merciless ruler who grew obese later in life due to his fondness for excessive food and drink. William, Duke of Normandy, defeated Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon king of England, at the decisive Battle of Hastings in October 1066. He was crowned king on Christmas Day of the same year. William had a well-documented short temper and had extraordinary fits of rage. In one instance of bad sportsmanship, he smashed a chessboard over the head of a French prince after losing to him in a game of chess.
It doesn't seem all that bad to me. You know, and I'm sure they'll get into more of these, but I mean, speaking of England and France, Henry VIII actually had a wrestling match against King Francis of France. So there's a long history of bad blood and competitions between the two.
As William grew older, his anger was matched only by his gluttony, both of which may have contributed to his early death and disastrous funeral. William's stomach grew so large in his later years that even portly Philip I of France commented on William's extraordinary potbelly, stating that William looked pregnant. In 1087, William made a claim on the French county of Vexin, demanding the territory from Philip. The French king rejected William's claim. The corpulent William then led a raid on the French town of Mantes, where he fell over the front side of his saddle, possibly due to his protruding stomach. William fatally damaged his internal organs and died about 5 to 6 weeks later from...
I think he actually, like the pommel of the saddle, you know, like the part that sticks up there that you can hold on to, I think that went in, like as he fell forward, it went into his gut and ruptured something. And yeah, I'm sure they're going to talk about what happened at the funeral. It's pretty gross.
From an infection caused by his injuries. At William's funeral, the servants attempted to stuff his long, bloated corpse into an undersized tomb, with catastrophic results. His decaying body burst open and his putrid innards filled the room with a horrific stench. A nasty end to nasty habits.
I mean, it's bad enough when a person dies and normal decay happens, but when you've had your insides infected for weeks and then you die... And then they try to stuff you in, and you know, bodies do get bloated in the heat and in the sun after a few days. And when they try to stuff him into, you know, something which was obviously made for him when he was smaller than he became at that point, and it burst, it was so bad that everybody left the room and the funeral had to be conducted without the guests at the end. Oh, I just can't even imagine.
Edward III. Edward III was a famously foul medieval monarch who pushed England into the 100 Years' War with France. After his mother Isabella of France deposed her husband, King Edward II, with the help of her lover, Lord Mortimer, Edward ascended to the throne of England in 1327 at the age of 14.
He didn't really ascend to the throne, though. Mortimer and Isabella ran the country. Edward II was, if you've ever seen the movie Braveheart, he's the one who is kind of effeminately portrayed by... the king of Edward Longshanks, or the son of King Edward Longshanks. And he did have Piers Gaveston was his good friend that a lot of people think was his lover. We don't know for sure. But he was definitely a favorite, and it led a lot of people to turn against him. Edward's overthrown by his wife and her lover. And then eventually Edward III, when he comes of age, has to overthrow Mortimer in order to take the throne for himself.
The young King Edward III was essentially a puppet of his mother and Mortimer until he stripped her of political influence and had Mortimer executed in 1330.
And it's a fascinating story how he did that. It was actually like something out of a movie where he got a group of his buddies together and they snuck into the castle in the middle of the night to take Mortimer. It wasn't like he gathered an army and defeated Mortimer on the battlefield and captured him. It was really stealthy. It was like a coup. It was really cool.
Although Edward rose to power as a young teenager, led England into a devastating war with its cross-channel rival, and ruled during the Great Plague outbreak, he will always be remembered for the disgusting habits of his childhood. As a child, Edward had filthy fingernails and had dirty habits when being taught his lessons, such as reading. According to his teacher, Edward would eat cheese and fruit while he read, spilling the crumbs and juice all over his books. Edward also let his nose run onto the pages of his reading material.
I don't know, it just seems like kind of I don't know how old he was when that stuff was going on, but it doesn't seem all that bad. And Edward III really was a great king. He was one of the better kings that England had throughout history and reigned for a long, long time. And it was unfortunately in the latter part of his reign, some of the things that happened late, especially him outliving his son, that eventually lead to the Wars of the Roses.
Henry VII and Henry VIII, groom of the stool. The Tudor monarchs appear to display an air of pomp and grandeur, but they may in fact be England's messiest royal dynasty. The first Tudor monarch, Henry VII, was crowned King of England in 1485 after he defeated and killed the Yorkist King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. And
something cool about that, well, I was going to say cool, just interesting about that is after he defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field, he had himself declared king to date from the day before Bosworth, so that he could then claim that Richard was actually the usurper who was fighting against the actual king, who was Henry VII. Just kind of one of those little quirks of legalism that a person pulls in order to justify actions on the battlefield, justify their actions afterwards, things like that.
By 1495, Henry VII created the Privy Chamber, a team assembled to manage the king's private quarters. One member of the Privy Chamber held a unique position that was prominent, highly sought after, and frankly, quite disgusting. That position was the groom of the stool.
Now, I will say this, I'm not entirely sure when he's talking about 1495 why they would show a Henry VIII from the 1530s. Why not show Henry VII in this situation? But I get that he's talking about both of them. Just seems a little confusing to talk about something happening in 1495, but portray a king who at this point is just a child.
Truly messy job. The groom of the stool's responsibility was to handle all matters relating to the king's bodily excrement. He tended to the king's portable toilet, known as a stool, and made sure water, towels, and a wash bowl were available for the king upon the completion of his business. The groom was also responsible for cleaning out the king's stool. Upon the monarch's death, the groom was given the king's chamber pot and stool as a keepsake of his grossly intimate royal duties.
Now, it seems really disgusting to us in modern times to think about this, but it was a different time, right? I mean, they didn't view certain things the way that we do. Privacy didn't exist in that time like it does now. Like, there were certain things that today we consider intimate and private that they wouldn't have thought that way. And the groom of the stool was actually a very prestigious position to have. And I think, I'll have to look this up, but I think later on that Thomas Culpeper was groom of the stool, which and he was the guy who had the affair with Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Let me take a look at that. Okay, I was actually confusing some guys here. Henry Norris, who you see right here, who was one of the 4 grooms of the stool for Henry VIII. Henry Norris is the one who was executed, and he was actually one of the people who was accused of having an affair with Anne Boleyn. It never actually happened, because that was all, Anne Boleyn stuff was pretty much invented to get rid of enemies. But Henry Norris is the guy that I was thinking of. It was just wrong beheaded wife that I was considering there. But yeah, a prestigious position, and as groom of the stool, you were also privy to a lot of secrets and a lot of inner circle type stuff going on for the king. So it was somebody that was highly trusted, and it was usually a good friend of the king.
This role may seem foul and undesirable, but by the end of Henry VII's reign in 1509, the groom of the stool had become a highly coveted and an incredibly influential position. The groom wielded immense power due to his intimate relationship with the king, and he was assigned a variety of important administrative tasks completely unrelated to royal waste. Henry VIII's first groom of the stool, Sir William Compton, was a close advisor to the king and was tasked with running the privy chamber, handling the king's finances, distributing alms on behalf of the crown, and organizing the king's massive collection of goods.
If you've ever seen the TV show The Tudors, now granted there's some fabrications and things like that in there, and they take some liberties, but Compton's actually one of the prominent people in the first couple of seasons who's a good friend of the king.
Needed when he and his entourage were traveling around the country, visiting courtiers and clergy. Just to emphasize the sheer scale of this exercise, the king's entourage could number 750 courtiers and staff in the summer, and as many as 1,500 in the winter. And
if you ever get a chance, if you're over in the UK, and I'm hoping I'll get the chance to go there too, to go to a place like Hampton Court Palace, which was one of Henry VIII's favored places that he lived later on in his reign, you can see how massive the kitchens are in order to feed all of the people who were at court. We can't even imagine. You think there's a lot of people that work at the White House right now? We can't even imagine how many people they were feeding at court every day, the amount of money that was spent to do this. It was a huge undertaking.
Compton benefited greatly from his position and became one of the wealthiest men in Tudor England. Indeed, the chamber pot wielded great power. However, Compton's replacement, Henry Norris, did not share the good fortunes of his predecessor.
Got a little ahead of myself
Norris
there.
was accused of conspiring against Henry VIII and committing adultery with the king's second wife, Anne Boleyn. He was beheaded along with the disgraced queen in 1536.
So basically what happens with Anne Boleyn is when Henry VIII's not getting a son from Anne Boleyn, and the last time she was pregnant she actually miscarried, and probably wasn't her fault. It was about the time that Henry nearly died in a jousting tournament, and that was something that would actually plague him the rest of his life, his injuries from that. But after that he started to turn against her, started putting his eyes on Jane Seymour, and so one of his chief counselors, a guy by the name of Thomas Cromwell, basically kind of was used by Henry to get rid of not only Anne, but some other people that needed to be dealt with, including people Thomas wanted to get rid of. And so Henry Norris, Anne Boleyn's brother, is one of them. There's a musician that was in there. There's another guy. They ended up executing like 5 people as part of this kind of big round of executions. They executed the 4 guys first, maybe 5, I can't remember, and then Anne Boleyn after that.
Ultimately, the power of the pot only went so far. Elizabeth I. The groom of the stool's importance waned in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the role was eventually done away with in 1837 by Queen Victoria. But that didn't eliminate the nasty habits of the royal rulers. During the reign of Elizabeth I, which lasted from 1558 to 1603, the groom of the stool was temporarily replaced by the Lady of the Bedchamber. Although the queen didn't have a groom of the stool, she was nevertheless a very messy monarch. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, bathing was an infrequently performed and uncommon practice. Elizabeth rarely bathed, rumored to have bathed only 4 times a year, whether she needed it or not. As Europeans began to explore and exploit the New World in the 16th century, sugar from the Americas flooded into Europe. With royal access to this new temptation, which was perceived as a status symbol, Queen Elizabeth fell victim to a nagging sweet tooth. She ate so much sugar that her teeth ultimately began to rot and turn black. It was said that she placed a perfumed handkerchief in her mouth before receiving guests to disguise her bad breath.
They didn't have Altoids or, icebreakers or anything like that as far as mints go. And if you've ever been around somebody who's got an infected tooth, you know how awful that can smell. It's pretty brutal.
It is ironic that the Tudors used a polish on their teeth that was actually made of sugar and so exasperated the problem. If the sugar habit wasn't enough, the queen also fell victim to smallpox during her reign, leaving her face etched with ugly scars and pockmarks. Elizabeth also used a heavy white makeup known as Venetian ceruse to mask her facial scarring. Venetian ceruse contained white lead pigment, a material that could potentially cause lead poisoning and madness. Along with questionable hygiene, Elizabeth had quite a temper.
It's amazing the stuff that now we would be like, why would you do that? But back then they didn't know. And it makes you wonder, 300 or 400 years from now, what will people look back on us and say, what were you thinking doing that?
On one occasion, she swore at a courtier and spat on him because his coat displeased her. One can only imagine the foul experience of being covered in saliva and shouted at by this bad-tempered royal. James I. Elizabeth's younger cousin and successor, James I, England's first king of the Stuart dynasty, was another unhygienic monarch who rarely bathed.
So let's talk about how it goes from Elizabeth to James I for those who aren't familiar. Henry VIII succeeds his father, Henry VII, as the second Tudor monarch. He has 3 children who end up on the throne. First, it's his son, who becomes Edward VI. Edward he becomes king at like 9, dies at the age of 16, tries unsuccessfully to bypass his 2 sisters in the line of succession in favor of his cousin, Lady Jane Grey. She kind of becomes queen for about 2 weeks. She's overthrown by Mary. Mary becomes queen. She's known as Bloody Mary. She reigns. She actually marries King Philip of Spain, but they never have any children. She dies probably of ovarian cancer. Then her younger sister, Elizabeth, who's the daughter of Anne Boleyn, becomes Queen Elizabeth I. She reigns, never marries, never has any children. And so with that, the Tudor line dies out. So then you have to go all the way back to Henry VII, to his daughter, who was the sister of Henry VIII, who married the King of Scotland. And then it was her great-grandson, James I.
James hated water and never completely washed his hands. He merely brushed the ends of his fingers with a slightly wet napkin. James's poor hygiene caused him to itch constantly, and he produced a vile body odor because he refused to change his clothes. James only actually changed outfits when his clothes became completely worn out. This king also frequently slobbered and picked his nose. As one can see from the...
Who wrote this stuff down? Like, who got away with writing down that the king had these habits? It's kind of amazing to me that that kind of thing was able to be passed down. I'm very curious to know what the sources are for some of that information.
The generations of English monarchs, nasty habits, horrific hygiene, and royal rudeness took a seat on the throne alongside the reigning ruler.
All right. We've got to actually look some of this up because I'm really curious to know who the source is for that kind of information. Let's check it out. So I've been looking. I can't seem to find any actual sources. I find lots of people mentioning that fact, but I can't find any original sources that say where it came from. Maybe somebody out there can help us with that. Use the comment section below and let us know. But here we have some facts in this book here. This is the Book of Royal Useless Information. James I joined his friend Philip Herbert and his bride in bed on their honeymoon night. He picked his nose, never seemed to wash his hands. I had such a broad Scots accent that many Englishmen had difficulty understanding him. So interesting. I might have to get a hold of this book, but I don't know how true these things are. So if you know of some source that provides us with information about stuff like that, let us know. Interesting that it wasn't at all where I thought that video was going. I thought it was going to go in a different direction. I didn't know we were going to be talking about actual like nasty habits of kings. But cool, something a little different for you today. I'll put the link in the description to the original video so you can check that out over on Simple History. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.